Welcome back to Things You Don't Know. Today I'm joined by Dr. Deneen, and we're glad to have you.
Always a joy to work with you, Dr. Weaver. You have a brilliant ability to find interesting topics. Today we're looking at a subject that deserves much more attention than it usually gets: Native American inventions, medical innovations, and health practices that help shape later medicine.
Yes, Dr. Deneen, you're really so right on with that. So, right from the beginning, I want to make an important distinction so we stay accurate. Some of the things we'll discuss today were actual physical devices, tools that native peoples made and used. Others were medical practices, botanical remedies, or delivery systems that served the same basic functions as later modern products.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver, for making that distinction. So, in some cases, we're dealing with something very direct: a syringe like device, an infant feeding bottle, a medicinal rinse for the mouth. In other cases, we are talking about native indigenous solutions to medical problems that so called modern medicine later addressed in a different, more industrial form.
Yes, exactly. And that really does matter because it keeps us from flattening history. We do not need to exaggerate native achievements to recognize that they were real, sophisticated, and in some cases far ahead of what many people assume.
That's very true, Dr. Weaver. And that assumption is part of the problem, isn't it? People sometimes hear native medicine and imagine only rituals, folklore, or only spiritual practices.
Yes, it kind of goes along with some of the uh, early settlers' stereotypic description of Native Americans as savages. And I could say a lot about that, and it's just so wrong. And that the stereotype misses a lot, just a huge amount. Native medicine certainly could include spiritual dimensions, absolutely, just as many medical traditions around the world did and do. But it also included practical observation, repeated testing, knowledge of plants, knowledge of pain, knowledge of wounds, childbirth, digestion, oral care, fertility, skin protection, and the delivery of substances into the body.
So, this episode is really about restoring complexity, if I may say so.
Hey, that's a good way to put it. We're talking about people solving real bodily problems with intelligence, memory, and accumulated experience.
And for today's episode, we're focusing on several major examples: pain relievers, as Dr. Weaver said, oral contraceptives, plant knowledge, syringes, early enema tools, skin protection traditions that can be thought of as precursors of sunscreen, baby bottles, mouthwash, toothbrush precursors, and even suppository style treatments.
And as we go, we'll be careful about language. Sometimes invented is exactly the right word. Other times, precursor, prototype, or traditional equivalent is the better phrase, and we'll try to be explicit with that.
We will, and that's a very good historical rule in general: to be impressed but also be precise.
A very good rule indeed. Okay, let's look at the larger medical legacy here.
Dr. Weaver, if I may, before we go through the individual examples, can you, as you do so well, set the stage? How important was native knowledge to the medical development of what we call North America?
Well, it was important enough that much of it entered mainstream American medical practice, even if later institutions did not always give native peoples the credit they deserved. Many historians of pharmacy and medicine have pointed out that a substantial number of substances listed in early American drug references were already known in native healing traditions.
So this is not a matter of a few isolated curiosities.
Oh, no, not at all, not even close. It's a part of a much larger pattern. Indigenous peoples across North America had long experience with local plants, minerals, fats, barks, roots, and animal materials. They observed what reduced pain, what cleaned wounds, what soothed inflammation, what affected digestion, what could help infants feed, what protected the skin, and what influenced fertility.
And because these communities lived with the land very closely, they were often working with a dual set of knowledge, an intimate knowledge of the environment and of the body at the same time.
Exactly, and that is one of the key points. Indigenous medicine was often ecological medicine. It was built through sustained contact with place. Place meaning plants, climate, animals, food sources, disease patterns, and practical day to day bodily needs.
So if a certain plant consistently helped pain or a certain root consistently eased the condition, that was remembered, taught within the community, and refined.
Refined, yes. Knowledge that is preserved over generations usually survives because it proves useful enough to matter.
And that also means the history of medicine is much bigger than just hospitals and laboratories.
Oh, yeah, very much bigger. Laboratories matter. They do, absolutely, indeed. Modern chemistry absolutely matters. Clinical testing absolutely matters. But the larger history of medicine also includes long periods of observation, practical trials, inherited knowledge, and local innovation.
So, with that foundation in place, Dr. Weaver, let's begin with something universal you and I sadly know a lot about, and that's pain.
Yes, a very good place to start. Pain relief is one of the clearest areas where native medical knowledge anticipated later pharmaceutical science. One of the best known examples is willow bark, which was used for pain and inflammation long before chemists isolated compounds related to salicin and later refined aspirin. People had already observed that willow could help with certain kinds of discomfort.
And that's a very important pattern in medical history, isn't it? The effect is often known before the mechanism is fully explained.
Well, that's correct. Human beings often discover usefulness first, explanation second. A plant can be observed to reduce pain long before anyone writes down its molecular structure.
So, the modern story of pain treating medicine does not begin in a factory. It begins with some people paying attention.
Yes, paying attention. That's right. And willow is only one example. Various native communities used other plants for pain, fever, inflammation, toothache, sore muscles, and joint discomfort. Some remedies were chewed, some were brewed, some were rubbed onto the body, some were made into poultices.
And that tells us something else too. Pain was not treated as one single category.
Very, very good point, Dr. Deneen. A headache is not a wound. A fever is not a toothache. A swollen joint is not the same as muscle ache. The use of different preparations suggest a meaningful degree of classification. Indigenous healers were not just saying, here's one plant for all suffering. They were often matching remedy to condition.
Which sounds a lot more systematic than the stereotypes allow.
It does. And we should also remember that pain relief in earlier societies mattered enormously. If you could relieve severe tooth pain, calm inflammation, or reduce fever, that could make the difference between functioning and not functioning eating and not eating, resting and not resting.
So pain relief is not just some minor comfort measure in the past, it's a major part of survival.
Very much so. Pain medicine belongs near the center of medical history, not at the edges.
I couldn't agree more. Dr. Weaver, let me hand this to you directly. Once we begin talking about medicine affecting the body in deliberate ways, the next big category seems to be control of reproduction. How should we handle that one? A little carefully, I would think.
Well, I suppose, people seem to have a kind of a silly thing about, oh, we can't talk about some things, but yeah, I guess we'll try carefully. Uh, Native peoples did not invent the modern 20th century hormonal birth control pill. That would be too strong and too direct a claim.
But they did seem to have knowledge of orally consumed plant substances used with a contraceptive intent.
That is correct. And that is a key point, really. Some indigenous groups used plants in ways intended to reduce fertility or prevent conception. One of the most discussed examples is stone seed. Ethnobotanical records have described its use among certain native peoples as an oral contraceptive.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, this belongs in the history of reproductive medicine, even if it's not the same thing as the modern birth control pill.
Well, that is correct, yes. It is at best understood as a precursor or antecedent. It shows that native peoples were already engaged in reproductive planning through orally taken substances long before modern pharmaceutical contraceptives were developed.
And that broadens also our picture of what the word medicine means. Medicine is not only about healing injuries or treating illness, it's also about managing life, family, and bodily outcomes.
That's a very important point. Fertility control belongs to medical history because it concerns bodily agency, family planning, health, and social stability. Indigenous knowledge systems were not limited to reacting to harm. They also addressed how to shape future outcomes.
I think many of our listeners will find that striking. It pushes back against the idea that native medicine was only reactive.
Yes, much of medicine everywhere is preventive, regulatory, or strategic. Native medical traditions were no exception.
And there is also something very humbling here. Modern 21st century people often assume that if a field was not industrialized, not produced on a mass scale, it didn't exist in any meaningful sense.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest distortions in how people imagine the past. A practice can be very real, very consequential, and very sophisticated without being a mass produced item.
You're quite right. Now, Dr. Weaver, let me give you a smooth turn here. Once we start discussing oral contraceptive plant use, we are really talking about getting substances to the body for particular effects. So let's go from substance to delivery system. Okay, we're looking at other types of tools now, and I think the example we have coming up will surprise people the most. When modern listeners hear the word syringe, they imagine metal needles, hospital rooms, sterile packaging, and all kinds of modern medicine. But the basic idea goes back much further.
Yes, in principle, it does. Historical accounts describe native peoples using tools made from materials such as animal bladders and hollow bird bones to force liquids into wounds or body openings. Those are syringe like or enema like instruments.
And it's worth pausing for a moment on just why that matters. This is not just a medicine, it's an engineered way of administering medicine.
Yes, that's right. And that is a striking point. A medical culture has advanced beyond apply this plant somehow when it begins developing tools for controlled delivery. That shows practical anatomical thinking. It shows people asking, how do we place the substance where it will be most useful?
So, if I'm understanding correctly, even if the device does not resemble a modern syringe visually, the logic is recognizably related.
Oh, yeah, very much so. A hollow bone can act as a narrow channel. A bladder can act as a reservoir and pressure source. In other words, you can squeeze the bladder and push a liquid through that channel. Together, that creates a device that can move fluid in a very, very directed and measured way.
And I imagine that could be used for wound irrigation or for enemas or for other kinds of treatment.
Yes, and each use tells us something. Wound irrigation means understanding the value of cleansing or delivering fluid into damaged tissue. Enema use means understanding that the rectal route can be used to affect digestion, relieve blockage, or deliver medicine locally or systemically.
That sounds surprisingly modern once you put it that way.
Well, it does, and it is. The materials are old. The sanitation standards are very different, of course, but the reasoning is not alien to modern medicine at all.
And I think this is one of the clearest cases in the episode where the word innovation is absolutely the right word.
I would agree. A delivery device is an invention in a strong sense. It is not just the use of a natural substance, it's a tool created to solve a problem.
And it also reminds us that medical advancement is not only about discovering what helps, but about figuring out how to use it well.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point you make. Substance and method go together.
Now, if we may, let's move on from fluid delivery to another kind of bodily protection, the skin.
Yeah, let's do that.
This is one where we need a little caution, ladies and gentlemen, but it's still fascinating. Some sources describe native peoples using oils, fats, or plant based preparations to protect the skin from sun and environmental exposure.
Yes, and the best way to frame this is as a traditional sun protection practice or sunscreen precursor. We should not claim that native peoples invented modern bottled sunscreen in the commercial sense, but many indigenous groups clearly understood the practical need to protect skin in intense environments.
So, in this case, we're talking about function rather than branding.
So, in dry climates, high sun, open plains, desert conditions, or reflective environments, skin takes damage. Indigenous communities responded, you're breathing into the mic. Indigenous communities responded with protective substances, fats, oils, saps, and other topical preparations that help shield or soothe the skin.
And that makes perfect sense. You do not need a modern SPF label to notice that skin burns, cracks, or becomes irritated.
No, you do not. People living closely with their environment often notice such things very clearly.
So, this is less they invented sunscreen exactly as we know it today, and more they understood the medical importance of skin protection and developed topical methods to meet that need.
Yeah, that is the careful and accurate way to say it. And in history, that kind of careful language is worth preserving.
Sure. And it also points to something larger. A lot of medical intelligence in the past was preventative.
Yep. Preventing damage is often as important as treating damage. That principle is quite ancient, actually.
It is. Dr. Weaver, let's move on from skin protection to one of the most concrete caregiving inventions in this whole episode, infant feeding.
Yeah, gladly. This is one of the most vivid examples. Historical descriptions, especially involving Iroquois related traditions, refer to infant feeding devices made from animal gut, sometimes bear gut, with a bird quill used as a narrow feeding outlet or nipple like opening.
And by any reasonable functional definition, that's a baby bottle.
Yep, functionally it is. It is a flexible container with a controlled opening used to feed an infant.
And what strikes me is the design logic. Someone had to think through storage and flow, softness, portability, and how an infant would actually take in the food.
Exactly. This is caregiving technology. It is not flashy, but it solves a serious human problem: how to nourish a baby who cannot be fed directly in the usual way, or how to provide food in a controlled and manageable fashion.
And that means this is not just a story about material ingenuity, it's a story also about family life, child care, and basic survival.
Very much so. Infant care sits near the center of every society's medical history. Feeding devices are not trivial. They can affect nutrition, survival, and maternal burden.
And even though modern sanitary standards would, of course, be very different, the underlying concept is absolutely recognizable to a modern listener.
Yeah, really, it is. Today, the bottle is glass, plastic, silicone, rubber, standardized, washable, and mass produced. But the core problem and the core logic are quite familiar.
I think this is one of those examples that helps our listeners realize invention does not always mean a machine, a weapon, or a factory product. Sometimes invention means solving an intimate daily human need.
Exactly. Some of the most important inventions in human history are caregiving inventions.
And from feeding the body, Dr. Weaver, let's move on to caring for the mouth.
Okay, oral health is often underestimated when people talk about historical medicine, but it mattered enormously. Pain in the mouth can make eating and sleeping difficult, and an infection more dangerous.
And native communities use plant based preparations to address that.
Yes, we have records of native peoples using rinses and plant based treatments for sore throat, teething pain, oral discomfort, and cleansing. Gold thread, for example, appears in ethnobotanical records as part of a mouthwash like treatment.
So this is not just vaguely something for the mouth. This is a rinse with a specific medical purpose.
Yep, and it is better understood as oral medicinal preparation, functionally similar to what we would later call mouthwash, though of course not chemically identical to modern bottled products.
And that phrase, functionally similar, is probably useful throughout this episode.
Very useful. It lets us recognize continuity without pretending everything in the past was a modern product in disguise.
And oral care is such a revealing category because it shows native medicine addressing quality of life as well as survival.
Yes, a mouthwash or oral rinse may sound very modest, but the ability to soothe the mouth, reduce irritation, or freshen and cleanse the oral cavity can make a meaningful difference in daily living.
And again, that reflects systematic observation. If a plant rinse repeatedly helps babies with sore throats or adults with oral discomfort, that knowledge is not accidental.
Exactly. Persistence across generation usually means repeated practical success.
Now, Dr. Weaver, let's stay in the mouth and move from rinsing to brushing.
Okay, this is another case where precursor is the best word. Native peoples used chew sticks and medicinal twigs, small branches or sticks that could be frayed at one end and used to clean the teeth and gums. In other words, they used naturally occurring things and shaped them to make the use, essentially the same use as a toothbrush.
And in some cases, I've understood the other end could be shaped into a kind of primitive toothpick.
Yep, exactly. So one simple object could clean, loosen debris, stimulate the gums, and sometimes even bring medicinal effects. That would depend on the plant, of course.
That's an elegant design, very little wasted, as with many Native American products. One item, multiple functions.
Exactly, and that's another feature of many indigenous technologies, efficiency. A chew stick is portable, biodegradable, and does not require a factory.
But it still addresses a very real medical problem.
Yes, it does. Dental hygiene is not cosmetic fluff. If people do not clean the mouth, problems follow: bad breath, gum irritation, tooth pain, difficulty chewing, and potentially serious infections.
And some plants used as chew sticks may have also had mildly beneficial compounds.
Yes, that's right. Depending on the plant, the stick might not only mechanically scrub the teeth, but also freshen breath or soothe discomfort.
So, once again, this again shows a combination of physical and medicinal reasoning.
Precisely, cleaning and chemistry melded together.
And I think this segment helps listeners understand a recurring theme in Native medicine. Materials were chosen not only because they existed, but because they were understood to have specific, useful properties.
Yes, that's a very good observation. Availability matters, but usefulness matters more.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to one of the less glamorous parts of medicine, but one that says a great deal about practical knowledge. We're looking at suppositories and other rectal treatments. This is the part of the episode where we remind listeners that medicine is not always elegant in the popular sense. Sometimes it's direct, awkward, and very effective.
Yeah, that's very true. Historical records describe native treatments for hemorrhoids and related conditions that involved placing medicinal plant materials at or into the affected area. In modern language, we would describe these as suppository like or rectal treatments.
And the medical logic is very clear. Apply the treatment where the problem is.
Yeah, yeah. If a condition is localized and painful, targeted local treatment can make a great deal of sense. Modern medicine still follows that logic.
It certainly does. So, again, this is not just a substance, it's also an understanding of root and placement.
Yes, the theme keeps returning in this episode, doesn't it? Not only what to use, but where and how to use it.
And that means native medicine included a practical awareness of bodily geography, if I can phrase it that way.
Yeah, you can. And that is a useful phrase and helpful phrase. Different routes of administration can produce different effects. Indigenous healers understood enough of that in practical terms to choose topical, oral, wound based, or rectal delivery depending on the condition.
So, suppository style treatment belongs in the history of medicine not because it sounds impressive, but because it reveals serious applied knowledge.
Exactly. Good medicine often looks less glamorous than people imagine. The real hallmark is usefulness.
Dr. Weaver, when we step back from all these examples, pain relievers, contraceptive plant use, syringe like devices, skin protection, infant feeding tools, mouthwash, chew sticks, and suppository like remedies. What ties them all together?
What ties them together is disciplined observation of bodily needs. Native medical traditions were not just collections of odd tricks or isolated folk habits. They formed systems of practical knowledge built around recurring human problems, pain, feeding, fertility, hygiene, inflammation, skin damage, and the delivery of treatment.
So the larger story is not merely Native Americans came up with some interesting ideas.
Nah, not at all. The larger story is that Native peoples were participants in the history of medicine as observers, experimenters, problem solvers, and designers. Sometimes their methods fed directly into later medicine. Sometimes their practices were parallel solutions that modern society eventually rediscovered in a different form. And in some cases, their knowledge was minimized or dismissed because of prejudice rather than for lack of value.
That last point sadly matters a great deal. A lot of knowledge in history, I know these from my African friends as well, has been ignored not because it failed, but because the people who possessed it were not respected by dominant cultures and dominant institutions.
That is true in many fields, and medicine is certainly one of them.
And there's something else here too. We modern people often flatter ourselves into thinking that real intelligence begins with formal science, our science. But intelligence has always existed, observation has always existed, design has always existed.
Exactly. Modern science gives us powerful tools of verification and standardization. And that matters enormously. It truly does. But it did not invent human ingenuity.
So maybe one lesson of this episode for our listeners and ourselves is a little humility.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's very fair. Humility and also curiosity. If we take older knowledge systems more seriously, we often find greater sophistication than we expected.
And that's especially true when knowledge systems were carried by people who have too often been reduced to stereotype and caricature.
Yes, good history restores human complexity where stereotype once flattened it.
So the next time someone hears that native peoples contributed to medicine, they should think beyond one or two famous herbs.
Yeah, they should think much more broadly: pain relief, reproductive knowledge, oral care, skin protection, infant feeding technology, medical delivery systems, and targeted treatment methods. Targeted treatment. The record is wider, more practical, and more impressive than many people realize.
So perhaps the final lesson is this. The history of medicine, as we said before, is not only the history of laboratories, patents, hospitals, and corporations, it is also the history of communities solving their own human problems with careful observation, memory, skill, and adaptation.
Very well said, Dr. Deneen.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver.
And thank you all for listening.
This has been Things You Don't Know.